Okay, the recording started. So.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for joining. Happy Monday. So as there has been, as exchanged in the email thread, there are two areas that we'll focus on today. One is design principles and goals. Myself and Bernard will give an update on that. And the second area is the feedback form that was shared, requirements document. I see, a few telcos and F5 also has provided their inputs, at least on the document. I don't know what the access issues that some of you might have run into, but I see there are 4 members who have provided their feedback. So we'll go round table and exchange, provide that input to the community. And beyond that, we'll spend a few minutes to outline what the next steps are in terms of finalizing the requirements, finalizing the user stories, and then kickstarting the path towards somewhat of an architecture specification and a path towards implementation. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes, Kaushik. Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. So without much ado, let's jump right in. I lost the doc. 1 second. Yeah, so the first part was design principles. Again, let me share this tab. Some of these things have historically been available to you through background material. There was a Google Cloud blog that was published around the time we announced Nephew. There is external material that was shared as part of the developer summit, which happened late June and so forth. So please don't treat this as a new form factor of design principles. We are just pretty much bringing those, reiterating those and bringing those to each of you a little bit curated from a telco-centric standpoint. So I'll step in, and then Bernard, you can please chime in as well. So there are 3 design principles that we outlined for Nephew as a community. First is Kubernetes resource model and configuration as data-based, common and consistent automation framework. What this implies is common and consistent are the keywords. What this implies is across infrastructure, network functions, and the network function configuration, there has to be a consistent way using KRM and CAD for lifecycle management of those resources at each of those layers with vendor extensibility. So we are not taking away the ability for vendors to customize for whatever custom areas that they want to do, but to the extent possible, the community should drive consistency across the suite of sourcing, configuration, integration, validation, deployment, and operation, the full lifecycle management of these layers of infrastructure. And the second sub-bullet of this is, in terms of common and consistent, is using machine processable representation as packages. What this implies is automation should work on common interfaces exposed by the packages rather than package-specific interfaces, which is what drives the commonality and consistency. I'll open it up to the group, but I just want to complete my thought. So that is first area in terms of design principle. The second area is more around dependency management, and this is around both cross NF, so between network functions, as well as between network function and the infrastructure. How do we both specify and manage these dependencies using declarative techniques and enforce these dependencies, including enforcement here implies reconciliation of those dependencies. So that's the second design principle. And the third is distributed actuation and reconciliation of intent. And I think this is a very important design principle, especially as we look at large scale edge deployments, a scalable methodology for ensuring that we are not centralizing the actuation and reconciliation of intent. So these are the 3 high-level design principles. Again, we can break this down into the second level of design principles and so forth. But the goal was to outline not more than 3, which is what typically human minds tend to remember, in a very succinct way, so that the community can relate to these and use these as the fulcrum of moving forward. There are some design goals that we also outlined falling out from these design principles, but I'll pause here for a second and any inputs, any questions, any thoughts?
If I may just add one topic, and I really like the summary which you've presented, Kaushik. So what I do believe is that we need to also try to specify a little bit more clearly what we would like to configure. That means sort of if we're talking about service configuration or configuration of software process, configuration of the infrastructure setup, it might be necessary to sort of, especially regarding service configuration, come up with some demarcation lines to identify how we would interact with northbound interfaces for service orchestration, for instance.
Bernard, that's a really good point. If I may, I would request that to be somewhat part of design goals / user stories. Like these are, like I said, I would like to bulletize ideally in between 3 to 5 high-level design principles without going into the specifics of how to achieve those and so forth, right? So this section of the design principle is more to create the outline, and the design goals and the user stories are more about the how and what portions of it, right? If you may.
Okay.
I see Anne and then Vishwanath. Go ahead.
Hi, just a easy question. Do you mind scroll up so I can read number 1 on the screen? Thank you. Okay. My real question is the NF and infrastructure dependency management. I'm a little unclear using declarative techniques. I mean, that's pretty much say Kubernetes. I mean, is that what you're saying? If I want to double click on it?
Yeah, so this is declarative is just using, it's a fallout from the first, which is KRM based, which is declarative. What we are saying specifically in number 2 is it's not just network function configuration, but being able to specify and manage dependencies and reconcile dependencies if and when there is a drift. That is what number 2 is saying. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think I get it. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Vishwanath, before you go again, I just wanted to level set with the community, re-emphasize, these are not new design principles that we're creating. These have been out there. There is background material that I cited at the top of the doc, which has outlined these. We just curated and presented this in a succinct way for the community. So please don't treat this as new material that has now come into picture. With that, yeah, go ahead, Vishwanath.
Sure. When I attended the first summit in June, I'm glad we have these principles. So one of the things that my takeaway was like, hey, Google is going to drop off some code sometime in the first quarter of next year. So wanted to get an idea of which of those design principles applies to. I'm trying to map in my head. Oh well, will all these design principles be implemented in that version of the code that will be given to the community? And second, I remember that number 2, which is network function and infrastructure dependency, that was not going to be part of the initial goal. That might come later, is what I was thinking. So just trying to think in my head what will come from Google initial code and which of the design principle will be exercised for the community to see. Is it something that you'll be able to elaborate on?
Vishwanath, I'll just park your question for a bit.
Sure.
I'll spend 5 minutes towards the end of this meeting to outline what the sequence of steps that we need to get to what you're describing as the first drop and what will be Google's and community's contribution. Like, if you don't mind, let's park it for
Sure. Okay.
Towards the later part.
Okay.
I see Wim.
Yeah. Do you hear me, by the way? Yeah, I think I wanted to maybe clarify the third point a little bit. I think it's a bit explicitly said. So like you have the distributed activation, but I believe also one of the key principles is the split between the runtime and the management cluster, right? So maybe we have to call that out somehow a bit more clear, that you actually have, let's say, the central validation type of thing, and that we try to, let's say, do as much as possible before we actually provide it to the runtime, which is going to then, let's say, activate it into the system and make and run that distribute. So it's, I think, somewhere, in my view, a bit hidden in point number 3.
Yeah, if I can comment on that, that's a great point, Wim. So like basically what you're saying is the idea that we have automation that works on constructing the intent and refining the intent before it gets delivered, say, to the edge cluster where it's actuated. So we're distributing the actuation at the edge, but we are centralizing a bunch of automation around the preparation of that intent or the creation of that intent. We're saying one person doesn't know all the intent up front. We know we need to coordinate construction of intent among multiple humans, multiple systems, and so that will happen earlier. So maybe we need to capture that somehow.
Plus, I think also important. I think I'm not sure where it is, but I think in my view, Nephew does. I would say, up to what I saw today, is there is much more hook for, let's say, configuration management and version control, and hook in the CI/CD pipelines and stuff like that. Whereas before, it is all a bit of an afterthought. So it's kind of you can basically, validate every step in the process potentially if you want.
Yes, right. So maybe just to remind us, I had a comment there. So unless somebody's taking notes, I'm not.
Yeah, my request would be, please add comments. I believe this document is shared with all of you. I see Laurent also had some inputs about design principles. We can take those offline and feed those into these principles. Again, I would like to make sure we don't expand these principles to not more than 3 to 5, because it becomes difficult for human mind to remember those. And I would like us to all be able to easily recollect these design principles. There will be subsequent design goals that will fall out from this with the what and how portions. And there's a separate section in this doc that talks about it as well. Next one. Who is it? Bala.
Hey, Kaushik. First of all, thanks for producing this document and sharing it with all of us. So I have actually commented a couple somewhere down, mostly in the user stories or the design goals. But rethinking, since you mentioned we had these design principles and you kind of curated this for specifically telco use cases. I'm wondering, rather thinking out loud, some of the points that I mentioned below. So do you think the ongoing management of an existing deployment, for example, day 2, day 3 operations, patching, upgrades, management, do we need to call out as a first-class citizen, as a design principles, or do we just need to have as a design goal / user story? That's where I'm trying to clear up my mind. What are your thoughts on that?
What specifically are you describing should be,
for example,
are you bringing up?
For example, if your third point, if I understand, if you design principle, if you scroll down, the distributed actuation is the, I think my understanding is what essentially we are meaning that, I mean, it will be the actuation of workloads / clusters are happening in a distributed manner. Edge for edge clusters, whether we creation / actuation of workloads are happening in the distributed manner. On the similar lines, do we need to call the actual management of those workloads in an ongoing fashion? Whether you're upgrading clusters, whether upgrading workloads or patching workloads, or applying security principles, things like that, on a day 2, day 3 kind of fashion. Do you think we should mention that as a design goal, or do we need to call out as a first-class citizen in design principles? That was my accept the question.
So if you're saying we should broaden number 3 as lifecycle management in a distributed fashion beyond just actuation and reconciliation, I think that's fair, right? We can expand that. But if you're describing any further detail, I would like to then scope that to the design goals and architecture goals.
I think you phrased it much better, probably renaming the third one as lifecycle / lifecycle management. We add that's gonna cover that. pieces and then adding the individual pieces either in the form of design rules or user stories may be a good idea.
I think we need to give that some thought. Like, it depends on how you define like a distribution of lifecycle management, right? So actuation is a very clear concept of the intent is all kind of well defined and just made real. It's almost mechanical. Lifecycle management might incorporate a substantial amount of logic, and I think that some of that logic belongs locally at runtime in a distributed fashion, and some of that logic may not. So I think we want to be a little careful with this. We can, but let's maybe further develop the conversation in the document or something.
Yeah. And just a little bit of a time check. I would like to give time to discuss the user stories in the other document. So if we don't mind, let's pin 925 as the finish point for this talk. And we can take, again, this document is shared. Let's take every other discussion offline. Sorry to be, not trying to limit conversation on this doc, but I would rather have us jump to the user stories as well. Eric? I can't hear you, Eric, if you're speaking. In interest of time, maybe Ravi, you want to proceed while Eric fixes his setup?
Yes, sure. So two comments. One is basically, on the design principles. I hope that there will be a mapping of this design principles to the architecture too, right? So how do you realize its design principles? I hope that is probably the next logical step. The other thing is because Nephew system itself is not going to work in isolation, right? Because you basically clearly identify the need for open APIs, and then also you need some kind of open APIs to allow multi-vendor cloud their deployments from a clustering perspective in the edges and stuff. So I think it would be good to reflect that somewhere in the design principles, is to basically say that the system has to operate based on these open APIs.
Yeah, that's fair, Eric. As in when we get to the user stories, the architecture, and so forth, we all should make sure these principles get applied at different levels.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, not Eric, Ravi. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So, but I hope you have. Is there a path towards we're building from the conceptual architecture right now that's there in the wiki and all, towards a more formal architecture, saying, okay, these things will be identified, will be realized using these functions, and these are the interfaces, and that's how it will hook up to the outside world. I hope all that will be articulated, right?
Yes, it certainly will. So part of, and between this group and SIG Automation, the goal is to build what I would call an execution plan, right? So we need to make concrete components out of that conceptual architecture, and then we need to execute on actually delivering them. So we're still, circling around this, is trying to take this, more loosely defined concepts and break them down into more concrete deliverables. But that's definitely a goal for sure. That's got to be done soon.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Eric, did you
Yeah,
fix your mic?
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So my question is much more about the transport layer, because sometimes when we need to deploy some specific cluster at the edge, we need also to have some specific constraints at the transport layer between, for example, the centralized cluster on the edge one. So do you want to also take into consideration all this part in this first phase?
So first phase or not, Eric, is a separate question, but transport is definitely in scope as a North Star goal for Nephew. How do we phase it? It's something that we all need to converge on.
Okay, thank you.
Sundar.
Hi. Okay. It's good to have all these design principles. I think it will be good to also add multi-tenancy as an explicit goal or a principle, because it's going to be cross-cutting across your NFs, operators, cluster infrastructure, and the whole gamut. So it'll be good to at least articulate it explicitly in a requirements doc like this.
That's a fair point, Sundar. There are some design goals at the bottom of this doc, which unfortunately looks like we'll not have this time right in this meeting. But what I would request the community is, again, go over these design principles, add your comments. We will try to resolve them latest by end of the week based on your inputs. And then there are design goals that fan out from these design principles that talk a little bit about what and how. Again, we are trying to scope the design goals at the top level only to 3 to 5, and then there'll be, for every phase, there'll be subsequent second level of design goals and so forth. We're not yet at that level of sophistication. So please take, please read up this doc, provide your inputs, ideally in the next 48 hours, and we will circle back with the updated version of this doc to the community, hopefully before, by early next week or late next week. How does that work?
That sounds fine. And on related note, right, in the design principle number 2, you're called out infrastructure dependency management. I think it'll also be good to explicitly say NF to operator dependency. If each NF has its own operator, whether the operator is really part of the infrastructure is a bit of a gray area, right? So you may want to explicitly say that part as well. I can add it as a comment as well. That's fine.
Sounds good. Again, I'm trying to the extent possible, not trying to discard your inputs in there, but I'm trying to keep the principles more high level, right? Like the specifics of how to achieve it at every stage. We should factor that into the design goals and sub goals for every phase. That would be my request to the community. Otherwise, these principles will explode in a way that it's hard for us to meaningfully, remember and apply these in a consistent way.
Okay, sure. Let me read the document and get back to you. Thank you. Yeah.
So with that, I know we are 25 minutes and I was hoping we could get to user stories sooner, but that's okay. I see there were 4 teams or 4 folks who had inputted their requirements for user stories for Nefio. So without much delay, if I can just find that document. Yeah, this document. Yeah, so this was the document that was shared with the community, I believe, early last week or something. So do you want to spend, like, maybe each person can spend about 5 to 7 minutes on there? There are 4 companies that provided inputs. Maybe there are more who have taken offline inputs because you had access issues and edit rights to the document. But maybe why don't we go roundtable, starting with Bernard?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to just mention that sort of for us, 5G core, standalone or non-standalone, ORAN, etc., only solutions domains for which we would like to apply these Nefio principles. Yeah, that means we could think of many other types of solution domains where we would like to make use of the same principles, not only limit the applicability of the Nefio project and the guidelines here only to that context. And what is important for us is that we come up with, as mentioned before, come up with a comprehensive lifecycle management, consistent lifecycle management for all those CNF-related solutions in conjunction with the infrastructure which is being provided by various cloud providers. And therefore, sort of our user stories were more grouped around, let's say, the life cycle steps and activities, where we were talking about how would we sort of consistently sort of retrieve the software artifacts from our suppliers. How would we be able to configure these software artifacts in a consistent way? How would we then sort of package those software artifacts and distribute them to the various runtime environments, be it edge locations, core locations, etc. Then sort of if we've got those sort of repositories sort of filled up with all those release bundles, then we would then want to have a consistent way of how we sort of then deploy those solutions and validate that the solution is okay from a functional and possibly also non-functional perspective. And then as soon as we're sort of in the operations phase, there should be a sort of an automated runtime lifecycle management, which also takes care of any kind of upcoming changes, upgrades, outages, etc., to sort of make sure that this whole solution consistently continues to work, even if there might be changes over the runtime. So that's the grouping of the user stories. That means sort of we've tried to group those user stories around sourcing, configuration, the sort of distribution, deployment, validation, and operations. And we've also added sort of certain KPIs which came to our mind. But it's just an example, sort of, and not sort of saying that this is the Bible, but more so it's just giving an impression of what kind of things we could think of as KPIs here. Now, if I'm sort of scrolling further down, if I believe we were adding something related to the further requirements. And here sort of, I believe I'm more relating to the design principles. So Kaushik, what you've mentioned before, consistent lifecycle management, etc., all those things you've already mentioned above in this main document. So I'm just wanting to make sure that if we're looking at sort of how do we address those so the design principles, we have some results which we can make use of in our communication with vendors and infrastructure providers. That means we would like to have some guidelines for the lifecycle management of Kubernetes infrastructures and the cloud-native network functions. We would like to have support from the main suppliers of those elements. There should be the possibility to do in-service upgrades and changes without service disruption. Ideally, we would have a reference management framework which would demonstrate how to actually implement those design principles which you've mentioned before. And in the same manner, sort of for all those elements, maybe you could scroll down a little bit further. We've just sort of added sort of things we would love to see out of the project. That means sort of guidelines, rules of how we would separate certain different configuration aspects. For instance, if we're talking about configuration aspects related to the network function itself, configuration aspects related to the infrastructure or inter-network function dependencies, etc., we would like to understand how we could separate those clearly and manage them independently from one another. And in this sense, sort of, we have here reflected mainly our requirements, which we would love to see as a result out of the Nevio project. And in the sake of time, I would like then to hand over to the next partner here, so that we're not hogging up too much time from our user stories. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Bernard. Ricardo, Vodafone.
Hello. Yeah. So it's Bernard's explanation was actually excellent. We're aligned on most of the priorities there, really. So I will just very quickly go through what our input was, but is very closely related to those needs and priorities that are common to most operators, really. So, of course, lifecycle management of network functions is first and foremost one of the topics here. Of course, there's a bit of a fine line between architecture, building blocks, and user stories and requirements. So many of the things that I've listed here could be fleshed out a little bit more, and many are actually sub use cases of something bigger. That needs to be in the architecture here. But when keeping in mind that this needs to be telco related, and Vodafone's first priority in terms of cloudification of the network is 5G core in the core networks and Open RAN in the radio space. The basic building blocks of for lifecycle, for managing the lifecycle of these applications, of course, are catalogs, meaning having reusable parametric templates that allow us to reuse the same code and the same artifacts in multiple deployments. Vodafone has an especially among the European operators has a quite of a large footprint and diversity in its various markets. So for us, it's very important to have reusable artifacts. And of course, deploying the same thing many times from a parametric template is something we're looking to leverage from Project Nephew, really. From there, having lifecycle automation, so what is historically in NetSystem called an FV orchestrator, but is actually could be actually just Kubernetes, even from a building block point of view. The automation of many of the lifecycle operations that we, as an operator, perform, including day zero configuration, instantiation and termination, but also more advanced use cases, such as registration on an element manager, for example, or a software upgrade. There are things that an operator does very often, and they're not very low-hanging fruit for Nephew, maybe, but there's still things that an operator needs to perform and industrialize to a certain scale. So these are listed among our user stories. The rest is basically an iteration over these concepts and principles between, of course, network function, lifecycle management, the various types of automation of functions, and what differentiates in many cases a Kubernetes platform, if we're talking about containerized deployments, from an enterprise to a telco. It's usually, we were talking about this before, of course, the infrastructural requirements or the infrastructure customization, such as network acceleration, or if one is looking at radio, for example, precision time protocol, or these kind of things. These may be a bit far-fetched for the version 1 of Nephew, but Vodafone sees them as very much part of the lifecycle of a network function. A network accelerator does not exist in a vacuum. It does not exist because it has a purpose of its own. It exists as part of an overall network service that enables us to provide something to our customers. So by automating these configurations, they're mainly software parts, but there's also something not as immediate to it, but automating these infrastructure configurations and the telco cloud configurations and items, of course, is something that we're looking at Nephew to solve as well, because we don't see them existing on their own, really. This is really it. I don't want to steal more time, of course, but declining and, of course, iterating these things across multiple vendors, so making Nephew actually multi-vendor. Of course, targeting free 5G core, it's okay for version 1, but Nephew's applicability and usability will, of course, be enhanced by it being adopted by as many network equipment providers as possible. So that's something that's very important for us to determine Nephew's success. And of course, its integration with its northbound and southbound systems. So slicing and its integration with slicing systems, or its substitution of slicing systems, it's also very important. It's a priority for future releases. And of course, the more advanced use cases for the lifecycle management of our network, for example, in-service software upgrades, or this sort of advanced operations, are something that I think we should target in the following releases, as they're not immediately easy to solve, but equally important from the operational perspective of an operator. Any questions, let me know. But yeah, this is Vodafone's input.
Thank you, Ricardo. Very, very relevant and useful. Next one, in the interest of time, Orange.
Yes. So just I provided also some global requirements to be clear that we are on the same page, because I had some feedbacks from internal colleagues about that. So what should be clear for us, we should be able to deploy the various CNF in any kind of Kubernetes cluster. So either in public cloud, either in our private cloud. So for us, it's very key that we are okay with that. We like to avoid dependency to dedicated, let's say, Git solutions. So what we are building should be, we should be able to use, let's say, some Git repo from GitHub, GitLab, or whatever internal one. If it's possible to get some integration with existing GitHub solution, because we also started the journey with some solution internally. So we'd like to understand if it's possible, let's say, to be able to reuse this kind of solution when building Nefio. And last but not least, for us, it's quite key also that we should be able to reuse some internal, let's say, what we call IT tools, typically to manage the security, for the secret management, for single sign-on, for example, to manage some access, management access, for certificate management, and so on. And obviously, we need to be able to manage what we call network service, but we need to maybe discuss that. Let's say built by different CNF providers. So I mean, if I want to deploy my 5G core network today, we selected various vendors, so we should be able, let's say, to deploy this 5G core network based on CNF coming from various vendors. So it was just, let's say, a global requirement to be sure that we are on the same page or not. So after we try to develop some user story. So for me, the first one is really, we try to write them, let's say, as a classical user story we are using in agile mode. So I mean, the first one is much more for CNF provider. So it's really, let's say, to help them to develop the, let's say, the CRD operator and so on. And as a result, as a telco, we will be sure that every CNF will come with the right operator, with, let's say, reusing the best practice and so on. So this is much more, yes, a user story to help the CNF provider to build their operator. If you can move down, maybe, because I don't see on the screen. So the KPI test should be the time maybe to develop new CRD operator for CNF provider. So the second one, it's a little bit like as the one from Vodafone. So we want to be able also to facilitate the way to incorporate to get the various CNF from the different vendor in our internal corporate catalog. So like Vodafone, we have many affiliates who would like to have also a kind of, let's say, a corporate catalog where we can reuse some artifacts and some generic configuration. And then what we would like to have is the capability, let's say, to modify this package. No, this is sort of one. Just to not to get the package from the vendors in, let's say, in a secure way and with the right process. To update them and so on. So it's much more how we, let's say, fetch, let's say, all the CNF artifacts package from the vendors to put them in our local environment. On the user story tree, it's much more the way to customize, let's say, this CNF coming from the vendor at different levels. So let's say what we call the corporate level, where we may decide, for example, globally, when we have deployment of, let's say, an AMF in various countries, to always use, let's say, the same parameter. I don't know, it can be a timer, it can be any kind of parameter. Then we should enable any affiliate to override this value depending on this local environment. And last but not least, to be able to provide adapted configuration in the site deployment, typically at the edge cluster. So the objective is really to be able to modify any kind of Kubernetes resources from the vendor. We should not have any limitation for that, and we should be able to do it, let's say, ourselves. And I think it's also an important point that is mentioned by Bernard. We believe that we will become, let's say, an integrator also to deploy all this CNF. So we must be able, as a telco, let's say, to integrate and to have this capability to modify what's provided by the vendor by ourselves also. User story 4, maybe you can go down. Yes, for lifecycle management. So obviously I need some tools to automate, let's say, the runtime operation. So including all this day 2 configuration, and also to be able to, let's say, to change some rules during the runtime. Our idea is let's say, this rule should be, let's say, stored as let's say, in Git repo with optional, let's say, validation from a human operator, for example. And also we believe that we may, let's say, Nefio in our ideas should also provide, let's say, some maybe some tools to give, let's say, insights how to monitor the various Kubernetes resources, and also how we should be able to manipulate directly Git resources. So it can be done via functional service, any kind of decision chain, but we believe that this kind of, let's say, feature should be very useful to be able to, let's say, to define any runtime operations that we want to be automated. So now we move to the infra automation. So obviously we need to have, let's say, a solution to facilitate this, also the lifecycle management for the infra management. So typically to deploy this various Kubernetes cluster on the links between them, as I said previously, but as a set of constraints required by CNF. So always in an intent-based solution. We also imagine that we could have a more dynamic capability to extend and modify a cluster, depending, for example, on the CNF traffic, energy efficiency, and so on. So it's maybe not, let's say, a short time requirement, but it's maybe a more longer requirement. And obviously, to be able to upgrade these clusters with no impact on the CNF running on top of it. And it may be not an easy problem when we are using SRIOV and so on in this cluster. And last but not least, it's maybe a point we should address. For me, it's not really clear if it's really part of Nefio or not. When we want to deploy, let's say, what I call a service, but for me, a service is much more, let's say, an assembly of various CNF network function, let's say. So today, either we can use some kind of service orchestration tool for that, but I believe that Nefio could provide also some minimum mechanism to describe what is a service composition, and also to provide some help, let's say, to define the various parameters that can be used in this service composition. Typically, if I'm using all this 5G network function, most of them are using some similar parameters, and we would like to have some, let's say, some solution to facilitate, let's say, the consistency between these different values. That's something for example, we face when we try to deploy our 5G core today. And I think we should have some kind of solution to, let's say, to build this, let's say, maybe common values between the various CNF. I think it's not very complex to do, but that should be also in the V1. So this is for let's say for V1, and after for V2, yes, we propose some ideas, but I think it's to be confirmed. So it's to get this a better unified framework to manage both CNF infrastructure and also all this transport part, and maybe also any kind of, let's say, maybe some PNF. So physical network function, not deploy using cloud infrastructure, but we believe that this Nefio on Kubernetes resource model should be very helpful also to manage other network function. I think also it's very similar to the WIM proposal, but I don't think it will be feasible for V1. Also, if we can have some help to deploy this end-to-end 5G slice, it could be helpful. So we need to define exactly what we are expecting from that, but do we need to define some specific CRD for this vision or not? It's not very clear for me, but we need more investigation on that part. And also maybe we need to have some kind of, let's say, what we call internal FIO management when we need to manage the services that are let's say managed by different organizations. So maybe that's something we may need in the future.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric, for for your use cases and also specifying the KPIs for each use case of how to measure success.
Okay, thank you.
So last one, FI. Let's try to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, sure, Kaushik. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I know I totally understand the stakeholders, operators here, but I thought, to give some perspective from a cloud platform vendor too. So the reason why.
By the way, Ravi, that's an important point. I don't want to downplay the importance of the overall community, right? So please do provide your inputs, regardless whether you're a telco, NF vendor, infra vendor. I think everyone's inputs are extremely welcome.
Yeah, no. I was saying more from the pain points perspective. They operate the network, so they understand because they have to deal with a lot of the legacy infrastructure and what it is to kind of migrate or kind of go to the next level of automation, orchestration, and all that. Yeah, but as I said, I would. That was my goal, to basically give a different point of view. But I think a lot of it kind of overlaps with all the previous comments that were kind of made. So just I kind of gave a kind of a brief overview of where we are coming from, because normally FI is known for its big IPC. So we have a cloud platform which we use to kind of do multi-cloud orchestration and workload management and so on. So idea is to kind of extend that for 5G deployment scenarios, and so that's why Nefio kind of falls right into the ballpark for us to see exactly how we could leverage kind of open source or technologies that are coming out of it. So I just place one precondition is that it's good to evolve these user stories with the architecture itself, because I feel it's very conceptual at this point. So to basically identify a specific functional components in the architecture and the interfaces will help everybody unify on the use case stories. Otherwise, people might have different views of the same conceptual architecture and might be thinking different objectives that are basically different purposes of it. So it's good to line up on that. So that was a precondition part. But from a user story perspective, I mean, as I said, we have put it in such a way that it's not really in a particular order. Because I think, as previous speakers were noting, I think all of these functionalities are being done in one way or the other, using a single vendor or probably using standards that is coming either from HC, TM Forum, or ORAN or whatnot, right? So it's good to kind of choose the use cases based on where there's a maximum impact, where the usefulness of Nefio can be actually shown in a way that basically solves a critical pain point, so to say. So the first one I primarily put again, this was all mirroring from the fact that, okay, the central use case is 5G, and think that with the 5G system, you have different kind of highly flexible ways which you could kind of deploy the system from a RAN perspective, which is kind of spread out from the far edge cell side to the edge regional cloud and central cloud and so on. So you have multi layers of cloud to be managed. So from that perspective, the first one what we kind of proposed to kind of have this kind of nail down this open API CRDs to manage multi-vendor cloud-based infrastructure provisioning and cluster creation. In the sense, and again, this is assuming that, and so the question is that how do you do this considering a specific customization or specific workloads that these particular clouds have to handle? And I think references were made related to kind of, need for accelerators or timing or synchronization, or, there are very specific real-time requirements that goes into where the RAN workloads and all specifically get handled. And also kind of given some references because, there are many communities talking about this. So a lot of these requirements I've stated also mirrors what is happening in ORAN or Working Group 6 and so on. So from a KPI perspective, it's basically everything is put in terms of timescales because I feel there is current solutions to handle this. It's about how better can we do in terms of timescales of provisioning aside. Is there a way you could handle the day 0, day 1, 2 kind of provisioning of just preparing the cloud infrastructure for specific 5G workloads? Then timescales for how do you kind of assess the timescales for adding or removing cloud resources or for software updates and patches? Again, as I said, cluster management is basically once you have the kind of the physical infrastructure in place, how do you create new cluster? What would be the open APIs for that? Timescales at which either the physical or the cluster can be managed and so on. So I mean, these are all kind of big ticket items. I'm not sure about the entire scope of what we are going to achieve, but I've kind of laid out in a very trying to make it as kind of comprehensive as possible here. The second one is about open API CRDs definitions to provision a 5G core slice. Again, as I said. All this has to be in line with requirements identified with the operators and considering the specific requirements of either control or user plane network functions. So I mean, the idea is that okay, every network function would have specific set of APIs or CRDs to describe based on the kind of deployment it's going to be used for. And from a network function perspective, again, the KPIs I mentioned there is from more from a service design perspective, where you are trying to onboard this, customize the manifest, and so on. Timescales for orchestrating a new network functions. Ensuring that once you provision it, it gets the kind of resources that's request. What means to say that how fast can you know that the provisioning did not go through and so on. And then the other thing is the day 2 operation of these of day 1 or day 2, you could call it, where you're actually configuring this particular network function as part of the end-to-end slice. Monitoring them for faults and performance, timescales at which KPI of the service can be monitored, more from an end-to-end service perspective. And the third one we propose is more from the VRAN instance slice perspective. So this is assuming that you would have, the picture I have right now in mind is that you have different Nephew clusters kind of customized for different kind of segments of the 5G system to provision to manage either the cloud infra or the network configuration or the orchestration of the different segments of the 5G system. So here, this is on the open API CRDs for provisioning VRAN instance or a slice. From a network function.
Ravi, sorry to interject. Do you mind wrapping this up in the next minute or so? I think we need to close it off with the next steps. Thank you.
Yeah. So as I said, this is primarily about doing the same things, network function perspective, but I think the key thing with vRAN is also there are physical network functions. So you could have physical RUs or RUs plus DUs. And so when you're talking about end-to-end service provisioning, you need to ensure that the provisioning process of these network functions of these PNFs and how they connect to the VNFs needs to be understood in that overall end-to-end service enablement. And similarly, the slice, because now with the vRAN disaggregation, you have multiple transport slices to think about from the front haul, mid haul, and the back haul perspective, or ones that connect the basically something that connects the different parts of the core slices as well. So that becomes key. And then one is basically where you are having this CI/CD machinery or packaging that cuts across all these use cases. Then from a longer term perspective, it is about seeing whether you could actually have an end-to-end system that's having this unified and a kind of Nephew system handling the different parts of the 5G system. I think it was also spoken about doing end-to-end slice provisioning, slice composition, and so on. And if things would help with that kind of efficiency perspective, makes this different Nephew cluster interface to kind of handle different aspects of either resource, fault, or performance management aspects. Yeah, so this is our point of view. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ravi and FI team, for your thoughts. So in the next minute or so that we have, so next steps. Request the community to keep adding your requirements to this document in the next 24 to 48 hours. I know we had some access issues until late last week, so not many of you would have had the time to do it, but please do that. I'm going to close off, meaning almost freeze this document by end of day Tuesday to the extent that we can. The subsequent step is there'll be a breakout session that Sana will help orchestrate with other telcos in this group to help then solidify the Nephew V1 use cases. So everyone's input is valid, but I want telcos to own the user stories of what problems they would like to be solved for. The goal is that should happen either later this week, early next week, in that small breakout session with the telcos. And we will, my request to the telcos is to present in the next SIG 2 weeks out to the broader community a common, consistent, agreed to set of V1 use cases. The follow-on step would be then we should, some of us will start to take the lead in defining the architecture tied to those user stories. And hopefully the follow-up session, which is 4 weeks out from now, is where we table or present the high-level architecture for V1. So that would be my goalpost. Again, we'll try to formalize these once we have initial breakout session with the telcos and see the convergence on the user stories. We will circulate somewhat of a timeline of how we expect these things to shape up and who the key stakeholders for each step along the way are. And I know we are at time, but any last-minute parting thoughts, anyone?
I maybe have one, Kaushik, is do you hear me by the way? Is maybe, are you going to, I wanted to have the user stories, are we also going to build like a roadmap or something like that? Is that the goal eventually with all the use case input to basically say, okay, this is this is the target for release number 1?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. If we do want to get to a roadmap, it may not happen by the next SIG. So next SIG, I want the telcos to finalize the V1 user stories. Maybe we'll take an action item to formalize a roadmap of, and this requires a broader conversation with the other 6, right? Which is also something that we are trying to orchestrate in terms of what the roadmaps, velocity of deliverables, releases. There's a broader set of questions that we need to align between the 6 to be able to then create and firm up and present a roadmap. So we'll continue working on that, but I don't want that to be the bottleneck to agree on V1 use cases and the V1 architecture, which I think is a most
yeah. Eventually, I saw the consolidation somehow should result in that. That was my question.
Absolutely.
One question for clarification. When you said freeze the document, you meant the requirements document, right? And
yes,
what about the design principles? Those I assume will come after the user stories and requirements have somewhat been frozen, right?
Yeah, Padma, this document is what I meant. In general, even for the high-level design principles and the North Star design goals, I would also like to freeze that sooner rather than later. Maybe not in 48 hours, but I don't want that to carry on for weeks and weeks, right? So to the extent possible, please prioritize your inputs into that other document. Both of these documents are linked from the meeting notes document of SIGART. So you should have access to these. Ping me offline if you don't have comments access to both of these documents. My request to the group is please prioritize your inputs to both of these documents, this requirements feedback as well as the design principles document by earlier to later this week.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I know we are 3 minutes, minus 3 minutes into the next SIGART. So I will publish the AIs later today, and then we'll work together with the telcos on the next steps in terms of user stories. Thank you, everyone. See you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Thank you, Kaushik. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.